Let's jump right into this explainer. If you've been scrolling through the headlines lately and feeling this overwhelming sense of chaos, you are absolutely not alone. Today, we're going to impartially unpack ancient biblical texts to see exactly how they categorize and frame this very real global instability we're all living through right now. From deep economic anxiety to major shifts in geopolitical power, we're looking at the source material to see what it has to say.
So here's our roadmap for this macro to micro descent today. First, a world in turbulence. Second, geopolitics, wars and rumors. Third, economics, scales of scarcity. Fourth, society, the human heart. And finally, finding purpose in the pattern.
Let's kick things off with Section 1, A World in Turbulence, the Modern Convergence. We are literally watching a massive global convergence of challenges unfold before our eyes. But the source material approaches this in a pretty fascinating way. These biblical texts actually have a ton to say about global instability, and interestingly, they don't frame these turbulent seasons as humanity losing control. Not at all. Instead, it's presented as a predictable pattern. It's a framework where a broken world is actually moving toward a much larger purpose, kind of giving structure to all the shaking going on around us.
Moving right along to Section 2, Geopolitics, Wars, and Rumors at the Macro Level.
Let's look at Matthew chapter 24. Jesus is sitting with his disciples, and they specifically ask him, "Hey, what are the signs of the end of the age?" His response? Well, it directly mirrors the kind of systemic instability dominating our international news feeds today. The text explicitly says, "You will hear of wars. Nation will rise against nation." I mean, that is a remarkably stark depiction of massive geopolitical unrest, right?
But notice the incredibly specific language used right after that quote. The text refers to these exact events as birth pains. Now, anyone familiar with childbirth knows that labor pains aren't constant right out of the gate. They come in waves, they recede, and then they return closer together and way more intense. By using this specific phrase, the ancient text completely reframes global shaking. It's not some death rattle for humanity, it's labor.
And that analogy illustrates a very specific progression. Just like childbirth, these texts suggest that geopolitical friction happens in predictable waves. You've got your initial friction, which then leads to escalating conflict, eventually peaking in intense, frequent instability. But here's the absolutely crucial takeaway. Step 4, restoration. The turbulence has a direction. According to the text, it is creation waiting to be restored, not just a world spinning uncontrollably into the void.
Okay, zooming in a bit, we hit Section 3, Economics, Scales of Scarcity at the Systemic Level.
This is where we find a highly specific description of economic crisis over in the book of Revelation chapter 6. Now, amidst some pretty heavy symbolic imagery, the text describes the opening of a third seal. This reveals a black horse and a rider holding a pair of scales. A voice calls out, 2 pounds of wheat for a day's wages. On the surface, sure, it sounds poetic, but it's actually an incredibly precise ancient picture of severe scarcity. To really wrap our heads around what that means, we have to translate these ancient economic terms into a modern context. The original text uses the word denarius. Now, in the ancient world, a denarius was exactly what a working man earned for a full, hard day of manual labor. Think of it as your entire daily paycheck after a grueling, exhausting shift.
The math here is absolutely staggering. Just one day of hard work. The text is describing a brutal scenario of hyperinflation, where an entire day of exhausting labor buys you only about 2 pounds of premium grain, like wheat. To put that into perspective, that is just enough basic food for one single person to survive for one day. There is literally nothing left over for rent, for savings, or to feed the rest of your family.
It's wild to think that this text, written thousands of years ago, captures the exact modern anxiety of extreme economic pressure. It perfectly describes the systemic burnout of working harder and longer, only to watch your purchasing power completely vanish at the grocery store. It acts as an ancient mirror, reflecting our modern dread of inflation, framing economic downturns as a major, key component of this overarching global turbulence.
This brings us down to the micro level in Section 4, Society and the Human Heart.
Look, because macro systems are ultimately run by individual people, we eventually have to look inward. In 2 Timothy chapter 3, the writer describes terrible times in the last days, but pay close attention to what he actually focuses on here. He doesn't point to failing governments, collapsing supply chains, or shifting borders. Nope. He points directly to the condition of human hearts. The turbulence is deeply, deeply personal. Just look at this list of traits: lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boastful, proud, unforgiving, slanderous, without self-control, brutal. The text explicitly connects the collapse of massive political and economic systems to these very specific micro-human behaviors. It sets up this fascinating cause and effect relationship, suggesting that macro-world turbulence is entirely tethered to how we behave on a micro level.
Basically, the source material argues that economic and political systems collapse precisely when human greed, selfishness, and a lack of truth take over. So, the extreme polarization and total breakdown of societal trust that we experience today, they aren't just political issues. The text actually defines them as direct symptoms of an inner spiritual drift. When the individual heart decays, the massive systems those hearts manage inevitably follow suit.
And that leads us to our final stop. Section 5, Purpose in the Pattern, the final synthesis.
When we pull back and look at the whole board, these ancient scriptures provide a comprehensive, impartial framework for viewing today's chaotic headlines. We see a very clear progression. The source material posits that macro-level wars and systemic scarcity, they don't just happen in a vacuum. They originate from the micro level, the failure of the individual human heart. It starts at step 1 with personal drift, ripples out to step 2 in our economies, and eventually shakes the entire globe at step 3.
Ultimately, this explainer highlights a pretty profound perspective shift offered by these ancient texts. They view global turbulence not as some meaningless, random chaos, but as a symptom, just like those birth pains we talked about. It's the labor of a broken world waiting for restoration. It's a predictable pattern pointing toward a culmination, rather than just an endless, depressing cycle of despair.
Which leaves us with a highly provocative thought to consider as we wrap up today. If these ancient texts are right, if macro collapse truly starts at the individual, micro level, how much do our own daily actions, our own selfishness, and our own lack of forgiveness contribute to the very turbulence we complain about every day? It is a powerful question to reflect on. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and remember to look at the micro just as closely as you watch the macro.